Education is what's important. Training, preparation for the expected. Education, preparation for the unexpected.
Good afternoon, Team Krulak community. My name is Major Ian Brown. I'm the Operations Officer at the Krulak Center for Innovation and Creativity. And on behalf of Marine Corps University, the Marine Corps University Foundation, and the Krulak Center, welcome back to the Brutcast, which is our series designed to connect the worlds of the warfighter and PME with the best in innovative and creative thought. Before we begin, please remember that all opinions expressed here are those of the individual and do not reflect the views of the Krulak Center, Marine Corps University, the United States Marine Corps, or any other agency of the U.S. government. We will also be recording this webcast for the benefit of our community of interest who can't join us today. So we ask you be mindful of keeping your microphones muted to avoid disrupting the conversation, as well as keeping your webcams off to help us preserve the bandwidth. At the conclusion of the presentation, we will have a question and answer session. So if you have a question, just type it into the group chat function, and we will get to as many as we can after Dr. Bell concludes his presentation. With that, I'm pleased to turn things over to Dr. Brendan Valeriano, the Krulak Center's Bren Chair for Military Innovation, who will introduce today's speaker. Sir, over to you.
Great, thank you. We're delighted and excited to have Curtis Bell with us today. Dr. Curtis Bell is the director of the One Earth Future Stable Seas program. He created Stable Seas in 2016 and is in focus on maritime security. He got his degree from the University of Colorado, and his organization just released this report, Stable Seas, Violence at Sea. He's going to be speaking to us about violent non-state actors in the sea-time domain, which of course is all the more relevant given the recent events at the port in Beirut and the accessibility that sea might offer to terrorist actors. We often ignore these actors, and Dr. Bell will enlighten us on some ongoing and current research in this area. So with that, I kick it off and turn it over to Dr. Bell.
Thanks for that. And thank you for the introduction. I want to thank the Krulak Center for hosting this talk. As you heard, my name is Curtis Bell. I'm the director of a maritime security program called Stable Seas, which is part of a larger politically unaligned, independently funded foundation based out of the Denver, Colorado area called the One Earth Future Foundation. I've left some contact information here at the bottom of this slide. Please visit our website, stableseas.org, or get in touch with me directly by email or Twitter if I can answer any questions after this talk. I know that it's difficult to listen to somebody for 40 minutes in a row, so what I actually want to do is spoil the talk and give you my 4 key messages. And then I hope you'll stick around to listen to me explain each of these messages. So the 4 key takeaways that I'd like you to leave with after the talk today is first that we have a condition known in the Navy and Coast Guard circles as sea blindness. And I believe that sea blindness is being exploited. Essentially, this means that we are not sufficiently aware of the campaigns that violent non-state actors like terrorists, insurgents, and other extremists are waging at sea. I don't think we are sensitive to the different tactics that are being used and why, and all of that is empowering these groups, and it's making warfighting on land a bit more difficult than maybe it could be if we paid sufficient attention to this. Now, to more clearly articulate that message, my second message here is that we could benefit from a new framework for understanding the full variety of activities that violent extremists are using at sea. Too often, what we think of when we hear a phrase like maritime terrorism is dictated by what has happened most recently or what feels most immediate to us. For example, in front of a U.S. audience, when you use the phrase maritime terrorism, typically people are thinking to the coal incident 20 years ago. Using the same language in a different part of the world, you get different responses to that. And I think that having a framework, a conceptual model for thinking about all the different ways this space is being used can be helpful for breaking out of that so that we can be more proactive instead of reactive on the maritime front of the war on terrorism. Third, I'm very happy to introduce a new report that we've just relaunched this week at stableseas.org called Violence at Sea. What we've done here is we've not only established a new framework for understanding the range of activities, we have created an atlas that profiles more than 40 foreign terrorist organizations and highlights the ways that each of these organizations are using different combinations of tactics in the maritime space to advance their goals. I'm very happy to be able to highlight some of the main findings of that today, and I hope that in the question and answer session or in correspondence after this event, we can carry on that conversation a bit. And then finally, I'd like to close by highlighting some of the ways that this perspective generated by this report can bring to the surface some new efficiencies and some new patterns of activity that we can recognize, so that in an age, especially during the COVID-19 pandemic, when so many defense budgets are being cut, even of really important strategic partners to the United States around the world, we can still find ways to maintain pressure on these violent non-state actors by recognizing that there are maritime pressure points that may not be being pushed right now. Okay, but as Dr. Valeriano said, we should start this by talking about Beirut. The timing of this talk is a little bit fortuitous because right now we are in an age where there's really only one global story, and that global story is the coronavirus pandemic. And it takes something very significant to pull attention away from that main global story right now. And I think we saw that last week. Now, last week, with this massive explosion at the port of Beirut, it was only natural that the immediate response to this in many circles, especially in national security and defense circles, was to ask questions about maritime terrorism. Could this have been an act of maritime terrorism? Was it vulnerable? What made it vulnerable? What would the incentives have been? Why haven't we seen something like this before? And really jumping, I won't say to that conclusion, but jumping into those kinds of questions is perfectly reasonable. For close followers of events in the maritime domain, this was bookended by two pretty relevant stories from other parts of the world. Only 3 days before this, Israel announced and released footage of a militant from Hamas who had swam off of the Gaza Strip way offshore and was then swimming back in to try to get into Israel, where he could locate some weapons that had been stashed so that he could shoot at Israeli helicopters, allegedly. So the Eastern Mediterranean basin is home to some acts of maritime terrorism. And this happened just a few days before this explosion in the port. Only a few days after, we saw one of the newer and more threatening affiliates of the Islamic State, this is the group Ansar al-Sunnah down in Mozambique, launch a major offensive on a port in that area, specifically aimed at disrupting port traffic and state control over this pretty strategic region in the north of the country. So targeting ports is something that does happen here. Specific to the port of Beirut, within the last 12 to 16 months, the government of Israel has explicitly called out the port as being a port for Hezbollah. It has accused Hezbollah of storing anti-ship weapons and weapons that could be used against Israeli vessels in the Eastern Mediterranean. And they've pointed specifically at this port in these allegations. So despite the fact that all evidence points to this not being an act related to terrorism, it did surface these kinds of puzzles and these questions. And what I would suggest is the fact that global attention has moved on because this does appear to be an accident, maybe an accident fueled by bad management of dangerous material, but an accident nonetheless. It doesn't mean that the questions underlying the tragedy should go unanswered. And some of these are questions about the vulnerability of ports. As a political scientist and somebody who studies the tactics that groups use around the world, the more interesting puzzles to me are, why do some violent non-state actors target maritime infrastructure and others don't? We have a lot of groups operating in coastal areas, and we don't hear these kinds of concerns in all of those places. I'm also really interested in the role that navies and coast guards might have in counterterrorism strategy. And I'm interested in how that role can be made more proactive rather than reactive. As I opened with, I think too often what we see is maritime terrorism being equated with the most visible thing that has happened in that particular part of the world to date, rather than an objective look at the different tactics that these groups have and their menu of choice, and what they might be most likely to select. So to start to get at that, my team at Stable Seas began last year with a report called Soft Targets and Black Markets, Terrorist Activities in the Maritime Domain. And this is a conceptual paper that's available on our website that seeks to establish a new framework for understanding the different kinds of activities and tactics that are used in the maritime space around the world, and then takes it a step farther and tries to understand what kinds of conditions seem to favor groups erring toward one tactic in favor of another. So in putting this report together, we looked all over the world at the activities that groups are using. We also talked to people all over the world about their perceptions and their concerns about the groups that they are immediately fighting with in these different geographies. And what we found really confirmed this fear of sea blindness that we went in with. This is the idea that we're most sensitive to what has already happened, what we're most familiar with, and maybe not being creative enough in thinking about the possibilities that we have yet to see. So American officials overwhelmingly talk about soft maritime targets. And this is probably informed by the experience of the Cole. If you have the same conversation in Southeast Asia, officials are much more worried about kidnapping for ransom and hostage taking at sea, and the consequences of poor maritime domain awareness and a weak state presence in rural areas, particularly in the Sulu Sea in the southern part of the Philippines and the eastern extreme of Malaysia. In other regions like Latin America and the Gulf of Guinea, the bigger concerns are trafficking and what scholars call the terror crime nexus. It is sometimes unclear when transnational criminal organizations end and politically motivated terrorist groups begin. In the Western Indian Ocean, there's also a huge concern over not only trafficking, but also some of what's able to happen there that isn't able to happen in other regions, like prolonged control of major ports and the taxation and extortion that happens as a result of that. So what we sought to do with this report is take all of that information and then turn it out into a useful but fairly simple framework that practitioners all over the world can use to think through different vulnerabilities, different possibilities for how these groups might exploit a poor presence in the maritime environment, and poor maritime domain awareness, and even corruption in ports that can facilitate some of this. So we sought to do that. We sought to identify why strategies are used in different places. And then we also started to try to think about how this is affecting campaigns against these groups on shore. So what we came up with is actually, I think it's a clever paper, because what I've described, a lot of very different kinds of activities, and frameworks aren't useful if they're difficult to remember. So we found that we could classify all of these different tactics into what we call a 5T framework, where we've got T words that describe 2 more operational activities, 3 more financially motivated activities, but all following this kind of alliterative 5T framework. And I'd like to talk through these 5. First, I want to start in India. The people who are interested in terrorism and defense will probably immediately recognize this as a photo of the Mumbai attacks in 2008. This is the classic photo that comes out of this attack. It is a major event in the history of terrorism in South Asia, particularly in India, and it continues to inform their approach toward maritime terrorism today. This is an attack on land, obviously. We're not looking at a maritime target, but I think what is underappreciated about the Mumbai attacks is that these really were maritime in origin. The Pakistani terrorist group, the LET, left from Karachi on a cargo vessel. In the Arabian Sea, they hijacked a fishing trawler. They used that fishing trawler to move in close to the port of Mumbai, where they then left the fishing trawler, went into the harbor on smaller, high-speed inflatable boats, and launched their attack from there. This is why I'd say of the people we talk to around the world, it's probably the Indian Navy most focused on operational uses of the maritime space, and what we call the first activity, tactical support. So what we define as tactical support is not necessarily an operation aimed at a maritime target, but it's the use of the maritime space for the purpose of moving goods or personnel. And what we find is that this will typically happen in places where you either have very secure land borders, which makes movement by water more appealing. I think this is the case in Pakistan and India. We also see this in places with extremely difficult geographies where movement by land is less convenient than movement by water. For example, there have been attacks on the more rural parts of the Somali coastline that have been launched from the sea rather than over land. For this to occur, we need low maritime domain awareness, which is a problem in much of the world, unfortunately. We need poor security for ports and harbors. And oftentimes, groups need to be developed enough that they are specially trained. And many of the groups that use this have specific maritime wings. I mentioned this instance involving Hamas earlier. This is one group that has pretty sophisticated maritime capabilities, specifically because their perception is that it is easier to cross the border from Gaza into Israel via maritime means than it is over land. And that's what we saw just last week when this swimmer was captured. The second activity is the one that comes to mind most frequently talking among American officials, and this is targeting. By their nature, and because there are fewer eyes at sea, there are many soft targets at sea. Historically, this has meant not only ships, but also fixed platforms, ports, wharfs, ferries that travel on very reliable schedules. And this is not used as frequently as one might think around the world. I'll get into that in just a moment. But we do find that in most regions, there has been at least one instance of targeting of some kind of maritime infrastructure. One thing I want to bring some attention to is that cyber attacks, and specifically the targeting of port and vessel computer systems, in addition to undersea fiber optic cable, is a growing concern, not only among governing authorities. This is also getting more attention from terrorist groups. And so far, we haven't had a really high-profile attack, but we have seen more and more speculation that there are groups that are specifically training divers to target that kind of cyber infrastructure. So that's something that I think we need to be aware of going into the future, though it hasn't happened in the past yet. Right now, probably the most pressing threat under this bucket of activities called Target is in the Red Sea and Gulf of Aden, where the Houthis operating in Yemen have taken advantage of the fact that they sit next to one of the world's most important shipping choke points. One of their main adversaries is the government of Saudi Arabia, which is very dependent on oil shipments through that shipping choke point. And because of the needs of the commercial industry and the norms we have around the movement of large vessels, it is fairly easy for anyone to get online and look at geolocated data and ship positions and identify flag states. Very easy to identify the vessels operating under different flags. So these guys can actually go out and target specific Saudi vessels if they want to. Here we have maritime IEDs, we have remote-controlled vessels. There's been talk of drones being used in this area, and I think all of this shows this confluence of new tech and this very old tactic of looking for soft targets in vulnerable spaces, some of which are in the maritime domain. In addition, we have 3 financial activities that we explore in our report. And the first is one that we call take. Take is a broad bucket that refers to any profiteering off of the seizure of people or property at sea. The highest profile of these is probably kidnapping of seafarers, although areas that receive a lot of attention, like the piracy off the coast of Somalia, are not as clearly linked to these violent non-state actors, these political movements, as one might imagine. Instead, this is much more common in the southern Philippines, where groups like Abu Sayyaf have used this as a way to generate income for years and years. In our research, one of the things we found is that making money by going into the maritime domain and seizing either people or products is not as common as one might have thought. But that's because to go from seizing something to making money off of it, a lot of things need to be in place first. First, the geography needs to be pretty advantageous. You need a place to take hostages. It needs to be difficult to locate hostages precisely. This is why these island chains in the southern Philippines, the rural coast of Somalia, the Niger River Delta are places where you see this happen, especially. It also requires some sophistication and connection to illicit financial networks so that ransoms can be arranged and paid and the money can be laundered afterwards. It also requires a low maritime domain awareness so that attacks can unfold and the response can be slow enough that hostages can be removed to an undisclosed location before a sufficient state presence appears. And it also is an activity that you don't see unless there is an absence of easier, more profitable financial activities, especially trafficking. So the preeminent case of this, of course, right now is the Abu Sayyaf group operating in the southern Philippines. Here they take hostages fairly frequently, though in the last few years, their kidnapping of seafarers has declined from recent highs 4 to 5 years ago. This is something that we continue to watch closely, and one of the bigger puzzles that we've been trying to answer with this project is why more groups haven't turned to this kind of strategy, which has funded Abu Sayyaf for so long. Okay, the fourth activity, and one of the more common ones, is something we call traffic and trade. And we make sure to include traffic and trade because a lot of the attention is on trafficking of illegal goods like drugs, weapons, and people. But groups are also making substantial amounts of money by engaging in legitimate businesses and doing transoceanic trade in goods as diverse as honey, fishing, all kinds of things that are happening. So we have a more inclusive title for this. Typically, these kinds of activities include groups that are well positioned geographically near transoceanic shipping routes. The Western Indian Ocean sees a lot of traffic and trade for this reason. Groups operating in South Asia also use a lot of trafficking simply because they are located between drug-producing regions in the interior of Asia and the main ports where these drugs can then be containerized and sent all over the world. These groups also need access to financial networks, money laundering, and oftentimes they have connections to violent groups that are located in transit or destination markets as well. So it requires a little bit of global networking. I've given an example of the Western Indian Ocean here. This is a really interesting place where I think that if we change our lens from fighting groups through CENTCOM or through AFRICOM and instead think about what are the groups that have dependence on the Western Indian Ocean and the Arabian Sea, it becomes very apparent that there might be new efficiencies. Groups stretching all the way from the AFPAC region into Central Africa profit off of the transoceanic movement of heroin and other goods coming out of South Asia. This is one of the things the report really brings out, is that we might find common pressure points at specific ports that are overlooked if you have a land-focused orientation toward countering these groups in the areas where they operate. And finally, the last one is something we call taxation and extortion, because one person's taxation is another's extortion based on the political status of the group in the area where they operate. So what this means is basically requiring payment by people operating businesses in areas of control. This can happen at sea. So for example, there are examples of groups that have a significant enough presence at sea that they can essentially issue their own permits for fishing. This happens quite a bit in ports where groups are on the take if they control ports. And then it can also happen in smaller coastal communities where people engaged in kind of the artisanal coastal economy may be forced to pay a certain percentage of their profits to a group if that group has control over the coast and if there's enough popular support for the group to enable this kind of activity. This is something that has been especially common in the Middle East. Groups like Al-Shabaab have been very strong in parts of Somalia and have spent years in control of ports, able to exact these kinds of taxation or extortion payments, much like they do when they control vital checkpoints on main arteries, roads. The same thing happens at ports as well, all over the world. So the main takeaways from that framework, before I move into what specific groups have done in the most recent stage of this research, is one, there's a wide menu of options for groups. And many groups don't even have to have coastal control to execute some of these strategies. Some of these strategies require coastal control and a great deal of training and sophistication. Others do not. They really just require a few vulnerable targets transiting the maritime space in a fairly reliable way. But one reason we need to pay close attention to this, I think, is that over the last few years, we have seen some fragmentation of major Islamist groups, including both the Al-Qaeda and Islamic State networks. And as affiliates spread all over the world have come to rely less on funding from that core group, like ISIS in Iraq and Syria, it's likely that they're going to turn more and more to their own funding strategies, and that is likely to mean more activity in the maritime domain, where some of these conditions I've mentioned have applied. For example, it was only a few months ago that we saw the first Islamic State attack in the Maldives. That was an attack aimed specifically at coastal patrol vessels because this group is engaged in some of these maritime activities that we've talked about. A second main takeaway from this is that getting ahead of groups and being proactive rather than reactive means that we need to think less about what a specific group has already done and more about what kinds of changes in condition might favor a change to a different tactic that we might see in a different part of the world, but have not yet seen used by this specific group. My hope for this project is that this 5T framework can help practitioners around the world think about that menu of choice that groups have, so that proactive responses can be developed for all of these kinds of activities, even if they haven't been seen yet in a specific conflict geography. And then finally, that there's some fluidity between what happens on land and what happens on the coast. For many of these groups, as I'll show in a moment, even if they're located hundreds of miles from the coast, more attention to maritime security could financially cripple these groups pretty quickly. And that leads to some exciting possibilities for collaboration between land-focused and maritime-focused military branches and law enforcement agencies, I think. Okay, let me talk about the next steps of this. Just this week, if you get on our website at stableseas.org, we've launched a very comprehensive new report called Violence at Sea. And what this report does is it takes that 5T framework and it profiles foreign terrorist organizations from all over the world, more than 40 of them, divided into three main maritime regions, the Atlantic and the Med, the Indian Ocean, specifically the Western Indian Ocean, and then the Indo-Pacific. For each of these groups, you can find information about how active they've been, both historically and in the present, in coastal versus interior areas, and then the extent to which they depend or execute each of these 5 strategies. So we had a nice team that combined veterans with combat experience against these groups, with researchers who specialize in civil conflicts and violent non-state actors and terrorism, people who've specialized in funding strategies for groups as well as the operations in these groups. And they dug through open source research for a little more than a year to create this product, so that for each group and each of these 5 activities, we can assign tiers of activity ranging from a tier 1 on the left, blue, there's no evidence whatsoever, to there's unconfirmed speculation or there's demonstrated potential, all the way up to there being pretty clear evidence that this is either happening on the margins, or this is happening and this is very significant, pretty central to the group's operations today. Each group, let me skip back, has a profile that looks like this one here that I've shown as an example for the Islamic State Libya affiliate. But we also synthesize and start to draw some lessons. And I don't want to talk on, I want to leave plenty of time for discussion, so I'm only going to go for, 5 to 10 more minutes. But let me highlight some of the main findings, and I would encourage you to dig deep. There are almost 200 pages of information in this report specific to all these different groups. For the groups that are active in the Atlantic and the Mediterranean, we see a pretty diverse range of strategies. And that's because we have groups that are engaged in the maritime space all the way from the Eastern Mediterranean into Latin America. I don't mean to hide the ELN over here under the table, but there it is. We do cover the ELN as probably the most important active group in Latin America right now. Some things I want to point out specifically about groups that are using the maritime space in the Atlantic and the Mediterranean is, relative to the rest of the world, we see more targeting of maritime infrastructure. A lot of this has been driven by groups operating in the Mediterranean, specifically in Libya. If you follow that news, you know that these groups have used blockades, more enforced by air assets than by sea assets, but blockades of ports. We've seen bombings of ports. We've also seen attacks on maritime infrastructure in the Eastern Mediterranean at a higher rate than we see in other regions. I also want to point out that largely because of transoceanic drug trading between Latin America and the Gulf of Guinea, but also within the Mediterranean, we have higher than the global average rates of trafficking for these groups as well. But I put this table up here, and I know I didn't put the names in. Maybe that's to tease you a little bit and encourage you to read the report to figure out which groups get which scores here. But one thing that stands out is that the groups that tend to score higher on targeting tend to do a little less traffic and trading. And the groups that rely more on traffic and trading seem to be less likely to target maritime infrastructure. I would suggest that one thing that this might be demonstrating is that a group that is making a lot of money off of the maritime space may not want to draw a lot of attention to its maritime capabilities. That could threaten a backlash that would then threaten the financial streams as well. So there's very much a difference between seeing the maritime arena as a target-rich environment versus seeing it as a place to keep quiet and continue to raise funds and make money off of this space. In the Western Indian Ocean, we see groups that are actively engaged all the way from Central Africa into Central Asia. And then, of course, groups along the coast where we would expect a lot of dependence on what's happening in the Western Indian Ocean. Groups in Central Africa are not as reliant on the Western Indian Ocean as are groups that are located right on the coast. But I do want to point out that armed groups in places like South Sudan, Uganda, the DRC, they rely on transoceanic shipping of things like conflict minerals, of wildlife products, teak wood. This is one of the main things funding groups right now. And a lot of that is happening through criminal networks that take these goods out of Central Africa toward the coasts into ports and then on through the Indian Ocean to markets primarily in Southeast Asia. In this region, we see the highest scores for trafficking and trade. A lot of this has to do with the fact that there's not a strong regulatory environment for fishing, so it's fairly easy for fishing vessels to transit the area and go through each other's EEZs. We see a lot of transshipment in this region because of low maritime domain awareness that allows goods to leave on one small vessel, be transshipped onto a larger container ship, and then they become impossible to track. We also, because there are so many weak or failed states here, including Yemen and Somalia, we see a higher degree of taxation and extortion than we do in other regions. Actually controlling port facilities or coastal communities is more profitable than it is in other regions where states have the ability to run these groups out of coasts and out of ports. This is one reason why in Mozambique right now we see the new Islamic State affiliate down there at the bottom, Ansar al-Sunnah, so focused on taking control of specific communities and specific ports so as to weaken state presence even more. This is something that is going to remain profitable for them sometime into the future if they're able to hold that area. In the Western Indian Ocean, we actually see less use of the maritime space for tactical purposes. Surely we do have an arms trade across the Arabian Sea, but overall, maybe because so many of these groups are located in the interior, we see that the ocean is primarily used to finance campaigns of terror, but not to facilitate them in the sense that fighters are being moved around. And finally, in our third main region, the Indo-Pacific, I'll point out a few things here. Relative to the rest of the world, we see a much higher dependence on the maritime space for the movement of fighters. And I think the reason for that is fairly obvious if you look at the map and you see these very complex geographies, groups that are active in archipelagic nations like the Philippines and Indonesia and Malaysia. Even in places that are not island countries, we see groups that are active in places that are bisected by large rivers, complex deltas, mangrove areas. So it makes some sense that it is easier for these groups to move fighters around and launch attacks from the sea than it is by land in these areas. There is less targeting of maritime infrastructure in these regions, though it has happened in the past. Abu Sayyaf's largest attack was an attack on a ferry. Some of these attacks have been political. There's been specific targeting of Catholic missionaries, for example. But we see this less than we do in regions like the Mediterranean right now. There's some reliance on traffic and trade here, but law enforcement authorities and navies also tend to be a bit stronger in this region than in some of the other regions that are combating violent non-state actors right now. So we see less reliance on this. That's also why we see less taxation and extortion in Southeast Asia as well. It's simply more difficult for these groups to control large swaths of territory and coastline in certain ports. That's not to say that it doesn't happen at all here, but it is less prevalent here than in regions where you see states like Somalia, Yemen, and northern Mozambique as well. So before I get to the very end of my 40 minutes, I think I'm just about on time here. I want to highlight a few conclusions that I hope will motivate a little bit of discussion, both in this session and hopefully afterwards after you have a chance to look at the report in more detail. First, I want to point out that looking at the world through a maritime lens allows us to see patterns in ways that we may not be accustomed to. That might allow us to find some new efficiencies. The cover of our report is this map projection that was developed by a geographer after World War II called the Spillhouse projection. You know, usually we're looking at maps that badly distort the oceans. And this geographer thought, well, let's maintain the integrity of the oceans and badly distort the land bodies and the coastlines. And when you do that, you can see why trafficking and these financial relationships between groups become so critical, especially on both coasts of Africa. It really is central to this criminal environment that depends on transoceanic shipping. I think when you look at groups in this lens, it also helps us break down some of the bureaucracies that have been formed around land masses. So for example, AFRICOM versus CENTCOM, both groups have common interests in maritime security of common areas. We're starting to see new security institutions develop specifically around maritime bodies like the Red Sea, recognizing that Africa specialists and Middle East specialists might be missing something by not appreciating how fluid the maritime border is between the two. So I hope that's a useful takeaway for all of you to take into your work after this, regardless of what that work might be. The second is that what we hope to do next is flip this question on its head, and instead of look group by group, start to look really specifically at what those common pressure points might be. What are the critical ports around the world that 20 of these groups might have an interest in some way? And what kinds of programming can be aimed at those ports, those trafficking hotspots, that could end up having a really beneficial effect on campaigns against violent groups operating across very different kinds of geographies? And then finally, what I want to conclude with, and would be happy to entertain any discussion of, is now that we have a resource that in a new way breaks apart how different groups are using the sea, what kinds of patterns can we find, and how can that be incorporated into planning for future campaigns against these groups so that those are more proactive and built with a mind to what groups might start doing rather than reactive and built around tactics that the groups have already used. So with that, thank you very much for your attention. I know 40 minutes is a long time, especially over a webinar, but I hope this has been engaging and interesting.
We're looking for more information on this domain. Where can they look? And then I'll toss it back to Major Brown. Thank you.
Okay, well, thanks so much. I'll be brief. I don't want this to sound like an infomercial, but we really are trying to put out a lot of good content that explains maritime security in these different geographies and why this might be of interest not only to a Navy and Coast Guard audience, but also to people who are interested in countering violent non-state actors on land. So if you go to our website at stableseas.org, you'll see that we do much deeper dives into specific geographies. We look at problems, including things related to COVID right now, like the sharp increase in the amount of oil being stored in unsecured tankers offshore right now and the kinds of threats that presents. And also, this is an invitation to please get in touch if we can help you with anything. We're pretty eager. We're most motivated when people are asking us questions rather than us just identifying questions that we think are interesting. So please be in touch, and thanks so much for your attention.
All right, Dr. Bell, thank you for another great broadcast for our audience, especially tying in a lot of those sort of second, third order effects of things like COVID that may not be readily apparent in the maritime environment. It's certainly a very timely topic and stuff that we have to think about. For all of those in the audience, I have the link to the report, and I'm going to include that in the notes on YouTube when we post the video, so that'll be directly available once this is over. So thank you to our audience again for listening to this week's broadcast. Next week's program will feature the first of our Allied Nation non-resident fellows. That is Sergeant Chris Ellis of the New Zealand Army, and he's going to be talking about move, shoot, communicate, innovate. How might we enhance innovation and innovative thinking in the military? We'll see you all then. Thank you.
Education is what's important. Training, preparation for the expected. Education, preparation for the unexpected.